He kissed her forehead and told her to take care of their baby. Then he walked out the door to spend the weekend with the woman he'd already promised to marry. That moment, that single, ordinary kiss on the forehead, was the moment Nadia Mercer's life split in two. Not the night she overheard his promise. Not the morning she sat across from him at breakfast and watched him flip his phone face down. It was that kiss, tender, practiced, completely hollow. The kiss of a man who had already moved on and hadn't yet bothered to tell her. She stood in the doorway of their Manhattan mansion and watched his car disappear into the gray November morning. 8 months pregnant, completely alone, and carrying a secret that would change everything. If you were standing in her shoes, belly swollen, heart shattered, the father of your child driving toward another woman, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this hit different for you, stories about betrayal, dignity, and women who refuse to be thrown away, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, because Nadia's story deserves to be heard everywhere. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The day Nadia came home early, she wasn't trying to catch anyone. That's the part people never quite believe, but it's true. She wasn't suspicious. She wasn't following a hunch. She had simply finished her prenatal appointment 40 minutes ahead of schedule because the clinic had a last-minute cancellation, and the cab dropped her off at the front of the brownstone on East 74th Street earlier than expected. And she genuinely thought that surprising Damon with dinner from the Italian place on Lexington might make him smile. That was the full extent of her plan: pasta, maybe candles. Quiet evening before the baby arrived, and quiet evenings became a memory. She was 31 years old. She had been married to Damon Vare for 4 years. She knew, in the way that wives of powerful men always know, without ever being directly told, that her husband operated in spaces she was not invited into. She knew that the men who came to their home for dinner sometimes left with briefcases that didn't belong to them. She knew that Damon had lawyers who were not the kind of lawyers you called when you were buying a house. She had made a private arrangement with herself, sometime in the 2nd year of their marriage, to love the man she slept beside and not examine too closely the empire that paid for everything surrounding him. It had worked, or she had told herself it worked, which, for a long time, felt like the same thing. She let herself in through the side entrance, because the front door sometimes can stuck in cold weather, and she didn't want to struggle with the key while carrying the takeout bags. The house was quieter than usual. She noticed that immediately. Damon's security detail, 2 men who were always somewhere visible, were nowhere on the ground floor. She assumed he'd sent them out. He did that sometimes when he wanted privacy for a call. She set the bags on the kitchen counter. She took off her coat. She was thinking about whether the heating pad was still upstairs in the bedroom closet, because her lower back had been aching since Tuesday. And she was thinking about names she and Damon had been circling around a shortlist for weeks without committing. And she was thinking about whether she had remembered to call her mother back. She was thinking about all of that, and then she heard laughter. It came from the direction of Damon's private study, the room at the end of the east hallway that she almost never entered, not because she was forbidden, because there had been an unspoken understanding from the earliest months of their marriage that the study was his space, his silence, his walls of files and locked cabinets, and she had respected that without ever being asked to. The laughter was light, feminine, and comfortable in a way that told Nadia immediately that whoever was making that sound had been comfortable in that room before. She stood very still in the hallway. She was not yet afraid. She was something quieter than afraid, something closer to the feeling you get when you're driving, and you suddenly realize the road ahead has changed, and you haven't yet decided what to do about it. She moved toward the study, slowly. The carpet in the hallway muffled her footsteps entirely. The door was not closed. It was open perhaps 6 inches, enough to see light, enough to hear voices, not enough to see clearly from a distance. She stopped 3 feet away. She told herself later that she stopped because her body stopped, that her legs made the decision before her mind caught up. Some part of her already knew what was on the other side of that door and was trying to protect her from the confirmation. She looked through the gap. Damon was standing near the fireplace. He was still in the dress shirt he'd worn to meetings. That morning, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, the way they always were by afternoon. He was facing mostly away from the door, but she could see enough of his face. He looked relaxed, easy, the same way he looked at home on Saturday mornings when there was nowhere he had to be. The woman standing close to him, too close, was Bianca Sorrel. Nadia knew who Bianca was. You didn't move through Damon Vare's social world without knowing who Bianca Sorrel was. She appeared at the right events. She wore the right things. She had the kind of effortless beauty that made other women feel like they were wearing the wrong shoes, even when they weren't. Nadia had seen her at 3 separate functions over the past year and had thought, each time, nothing more than, Damon works with her peripherally. She exists in his orbit, the way many people exist in his orbit. She had not considered Bianca Sorrel a threat. She considered it now. Bianca said something Nadia couldn't fully hear. Then she laughed again, and the laugh was private in a way that had nothing to do with business. Damon responded, and Bianca tilted her head and said, clearly enough to travel through a 6-inch gap in a doorway, "How much longer do I have to wait?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Nadia's hand went to her stomach without her choosing to put it there. Damon looked at Bianca directly. He did not hesitate. He did not look uncomfortable. He said, "Not much longer. You'll be my wife soon," and then he kissed her. It was not a stolen kiss. It was not the kind of kiss that belonged to a man who was doing something he knew was wrong. It was practiced, easy. The kiss of a man who had been kissing this woman for long enough that the act felt ordinary to him. Nadia did not move. Her mind did something strange in that moment, simply refused to process the information at full speed. It slowed everything down. She was aware of the carpet beneath her feet. She was aware of the hallway light. She was aware of the shape of her own shadow on the wall beside her. She was aware of the weight in her abdomen, the solid, inhabited weight of a child who was less than 6 weeks from being born. She backed away. One step, then another, moving backward down the hallway, the way you move when you're trying not to make a sound in a house where you've suddenly become a stranger. She reached the kitchen. She stood beside the takeout bags she had carried home 40 minutes ago, when the world was still a different shape. She did not cry. She couldn't yet. Her body had not caught up to what her mind now knew, and her mind had not caught up to what her life now meant. She left the house through the side entrance. She sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away for an hour and 40 minutes, and she ordered a chamomile tea she did not drink, and she thought about nothing and everything simultaneously. And the baby moved twice, and she put her hand against her coat and felt it, and something in her chest cracked open so slowly that she wasn't sure it had cracked at all. By the time she walked home because she had nowhere else to go, because the house was still technically her home, because she had not yet figured out what she was going to do, Damon's car was gone. The study was dark. The house was the house again. She put the takeout bags in the refrigerator. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a long time. She did not sleep. The next morning was a Thursday. She knew, going into it, that the morning was going to require something from her that she had never been required to produce before. She had always considered herself reasonably good at composure. She did not fall apart in front of people. She had grown up with a mother who treated public emotion as a form of immodesty, and some of that had stuck whether she wanted it to or not. But this was different. This was sitting across a breakfast table from the man who had, less than 14 hours ago, promised another woman his last name, and behaving as though the world was exactly the size and shape she had always believed it to be. Do it, she told herself. She had to do it. She did not yet know why, only that she needed time. Time to think. Time to understand what she was dealing with. Time to not make a decision in the white heat of something this enormous. Damon came downstairs at 7:40. He was wearing his gray sweater, the one she'd bought him 2 Christmases ago. He kissed her cheek. He poured his coffee. He asked how she'd slept. She said fine. She asked how his evening had been. He said quiet. He said he'd gone to bed early. She watched his face as he said it. He was a very good liar. She had always known that in the abstract. You didn't run what Damon ran without being able to look people in the eye and say things that weren't true. She had simply never been on the receiving end of it before, or at least, she had never known she was. Then his phone lit up on the table between them. She didn't read the name. She didn't need to. She read his face, the tiny, almost imperceptible shift that happened when he saw the screen. The way he reached for the phone and turned it face down in a single fluid motion. Casual, practiced, the gesture of a man who had been managing two realities for long enough that the management had become instinct. Anything important, she asked. Work, he said. He picked up his coffee. The conversation moved on, and Nadia sat there with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into an expression of ordinary morning calm, and she felt something shift inside her. Not grief. Not yet. Something harder than grief. Something that didn't have a name she recognized, but that felt, in some essential way, like clarity. She was not going to confront him at this table. She was not going to cry. She was not going to give him the advantage of knowing that she knew. Because here was the thing about Damon Vare that she understood, perhaps better than anyone, better than his lieutenants, better than his lawyers, better than the men who both feared and needed him. She understood it because she had lived with him for 4 years, in the spaces between the version of himself he showed to the world. The thing about Damon was that he operated from a position of information. Always. He never made a move until he understood the landscape. He never entered a room until he knew who was in it. He had built everything he had on the principle that knowledge was leverage, and leverage was power, and power was the only thing in the world that was permanent. He did not know that she knew, which meant for perhaps the first time in their marriage, the information advantage was hers. She was 8 months pregnant, and her back hurt, and her husband was in love with another woman, and the world she had built inside their life together was quietly coming apart at the seams. But she had an advantage. She was going to use it. It took her 3 days to start looking. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, exactly, in the beginning. She only knew that Damon had mentioned, early in their marriage almost offhandedly, the way he mentioned things he didn't consider important enough to elaborate on that certain assets were held jointly or under her name for legal reasons. She had not asked questions. She had not been interested in questions. She had been 27 and newly married and more focused on building a life than cataloging the architecture of one. Now she was interested. She started with what she had direct access to. Bank accounts, property documents, the paperwork in the home office that she'd never had reason to go through. She was methodical. She worked when Damon was out, which was most of the day, and she photographed documents with her phone rather than removing them. And she told herself that what she was doing was not betrayal, because the man who had defined betrayal in their marriage was not her. What she found was more than she expected. There were investment accounts she had not known existed. Property in Connecticut held jointly a house she had visited once, years ago, and half forgotten. A series of legitimate business holdings structured through shell companies, some of which listed her as a co-director. There were assets that Damon had placed under her name, not out of generosity, but out of strategy legal protection for himself, which now, inadvertently, meant legal protection for her. She called her college friend, Petra, who had married a corporate attorney and who was, therefore, adjacent to one. She did not tell Petra everything. She said only that she needed a referral to a family attorney who was not connected to anyone she or her husband knew professionally. Petra, who was perceptive in the way of women who have spent years quietly paying attention, asked only one question. "Are you okay?" Nadia thought about it. "I'm getting there," she said. Petra sent her 3 names by noon. On the 5th day after the study, Nadia found the apartment. She hadn't been looking for it, specifically. She had been cross-referencing financial documents and following a thread that led from one account to another, and then to a property transaction, and then to an address on the Upper West Side that she did not recognize, and that had no connection to any business she could identify. She sat with that address for a long time. She already knew what it was. She already knew whose it was. But she looked it up anyway, because she had committed to understanding the full shape of what she was dealing with, and the full shape required her to look at all of it, even the parts that felt like pressing on a bruise. The apartment had been purchased 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, Nadia had been 33 weeks pregnant. She and Damon had spent a Saturday painting the nursery together. She remembered it clearly, the way he'd gotten paint on his elbow and laughed about it, and the way she'd thought that afternoon, this is what it's supposed to feel like. 6 weeks ago, he had been buying Bianca Sorrell an apartment on the Upper West Side. She put the documents down. She put them down very carefully, on the desk in the home office, and she pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. Slowly, the way the prenatal instructor had taught her for labor, and she thought, not yet. You don't get to break yet. There's more to do first. She picked the documents back up. It was the lawyer who confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She met him in Midtown at a small office that had none of the trappings of the kind of legal world. Damon moved through no mahogany, no skyline view, no sense that the room itself was performing authority. His name was Arthur Gaines. He was 60, balding slightly, and he had a way of listening that made Nadia feel, for the first time in 2 weeks, like someone was actually hearing her. She laid out what she had found, methodically, without breaking down, which surprised her. Arthur Gaines was quiet for a long moment when she finished. Then he said, "Your husband isn't careless, but he made one significant miscalculation." She waited. "He spent years building legal distance between himself and his holdings by using your name. He did it to protect himself from liability. But the law doesn't distinguish between his reasons for putting assets in your name and the outcome. What's in your name belongs to you." Nadia looked at him. "How much of it can he move before I can stop him?" "That," said Arthur Gaines, "is exactly the right question." They spent the next 90 minutes mapping out what was protectable, what was contestable, and what she needed to do, and in what order, and by when. He was precise. He did not editorialize. He did not tell her what to feel. He told her what was possible and what it would require. When she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "He's going to be very angry," she said. It was not a complaint. It was simply an assessment. Arthur looked at her steadily. "That's his response to process. We'll focus on what you can control." She nodded. She walked out of his office and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, the city moving around her the way it always did, indifferent, loud, entirely unconcerned with the private disasters of any individual life, and she put one hand against her stomach and felt the baby shift and resettle. "I know," she said quietly, to herself, to her daughter, to the cold air. "I know." On the 11th day, Damon told her he was leaving for the weekend. Told her over dinner. He said it was business, a meeting in Connecticut that required him to stay over, possibly 2 nights. He said he'd have his phone. He said to call if anything happened with the baby. Nadia said, "Of course." She said, "Travel safe." She asked if he wanted her to pack anything for him. He said he'd taken care of it. She had a very specific way in those days of filing away the moments that hurt the most. She would feel them completely, let them move through her like weather, and then she would fold them up and put them somewhere interior and return her face to its current configuration and continue. It was not healthy, probably. It was survival. She watched him eat his dinner. She watched him talk about something she no longer tracked the content of. She watched him be, completely, and with no apparent effort, a man with no guilt about anything at all. And she thought, he has no idea. He kissed her forehead before he left the next morning. He told her to take care of their baby. He walked out into the gray morning, and his car pulled away from the curb, and he was gone. Nadia stood in the doorway until she couldn't see the car anymore. Then she turned and went inside and called Arthur Gaines. "It's time," she said. "Let's finish this." Arthur Gaines picked up on the second ring. He didn't say good morning. He said, "Are you somewhere private?" "Yes. Everything is ready on my end. The question is timing. Once we file, there's no quiet version of this anymore." Nadia was standing in the kitchen with her coat still on and her husband's car not yet out of sight around the corner. She could see the takeout bags she'd put in the refrigerator 11 days ago. She'd never taken them out. Some part of her had left them there, on purpose, some part of her that wasn't ready to close that particular door. The door that led back to the woman who had bought pasta and thought candles might make her husband smile. She reached over and opened the refrigerator. She looked at the bags for a second. Then she took them out and dropped them into the trash. Today, she said, let's do it today. Arthur Gaines said, come in at 2. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen that had been hers. For 4 years, the kitchen where she had cooked for Damon's business associates and hosted his Christmas gatherings, and learned, slowly and without being directly taught, how to be the wife of a man like Damon Vare, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slowly, and she thought about everything she needed to do before 2 o'clock. There was more than she expected. There always was. She started upstairs. The first thing she did was sit on the edge of the bed and make a list. Not on her phone, where anything could be accessed, but in a small paper notebook she'd bought 2 days earlier and kept in her coat pocket. She wrote in a handwriting smaller than her natural one, a habit from childhood she'd never quite shed. The list was not emotional. It was functional. It covered what needed to move, what needed to be documented, what needed to be done in what sequence, and what she could not afford to forget. She had been making versions of this list for 5 days. This was the final version. She worked through the morning with the kind of focus that only arrives when the alternative to focus is collapse. She gathered the documents she'd photographed and printed at the FedEx on Lexington 3 days ago, the account statements, the property records, the corporate filings that listed her name as co-director of entities she'd never attended a meeting for. She organized them by category, the way Arthur had taught her during their second meeting. She put them in a folder. She put the folder in the bag she'd been quietly building over the past week, not a suitcase, nothing that obvious, just a large leather tote that she'd always used for errands, now carrying the dismantled architecture of her marriage. Twice she stopped. Once when she passed the nursery and saw the crib they'd assembled together. Sunset on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks ago, Damon cross-legged on the floor, with the instructions spread around him, swearing under his breath at the hardware and making her laugh despite herself. She stood in the doorway of that room for a while. She did not go in. The second time she stopped was when she found in the back of Damon's desk drawer a drawer she'd never opened before, not out of obedience, but out of genuine disinterest, a photograph. Old. The edges were soft with handling. It was a picture of Damon that she'd never seen before. Taken before they'd met, he looked young in it, early 20s at most, standing outside a building she didn't recognize with a man she'd never seen. He was grinning in the photograph, unguarded, open in a way that the Damon she'd married rarely allowed himself to be. She looked at it for a long moment. She put it back exactly where she'd found it. Closed the drawer. She did not let herself think about the man in that photograph too long. That man and the man who had kissed Bianca Sorrell beside the fireplace, while his pregnant wife stood 3 feet away. Those 2 men were not her problem to reconcile. That was his work to do, if he ever chose to do it. Hers was something else entirely. She left the house at 1:15. She did not look back at it from the street. She was not ready to do that yet. Arthur Gaines's office was exactly as she remembered it, small, unhurried, entirely devoid of performance. He had 2 associates with him this time, a woman named Clara, who handled filings, and a younger man named Seth, who specialized in asset protection. They were polite and efficient, and treated Nadia not as a victim to be managed, but as a client with a specific objective, which was exactly what she needed. They went through everything. It took 3 hours. There were moments when the numbers were so large that they seemed abstract, not real money, just figures on paper, part of a structure so layered that it barely resembled anything as ordinary as wealth. But Arthur kept pulling her back to what was concrete, what was actionable, what was hers under law regardless of intent or circumstance. He's going to claim the joint assets were nominal, Arthur said at one point, that your name was administrative. His attorneys will argue that the substance of the holdings belonged entirely to his operations. Can they prove that? They can argue it. Whether they prove it depends on documentation, testimony, and what a judge decides to credit. He set down his pen. But here's what complicates their argument significantly. Several of these accounts show contributions that originated from sources with no clear tie to his operations. Clean money, traceable to legitimate business revenue. Your name isn't just decorative on those accounts. It's functional. Nadia processed that. What does that mean in plain language? It means, Clara said, looking up from her laptop, that the story they'll want to tell, that you were just a name on paper, is harder to tell cleanly. Judges don't love that story when there's evidence of functional joint use. Nadia nodded slowly. What do I sign today? What she signed that afternoon was not the divorce papers. Those came later. What she signed were the documents that initiated a legal separation of the joint assets. She had clearest claim to a process that, once completed, would move certain holdings into a protected status before Damon could be advised by his own lawyers to do otherwise. It was not illegal. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of legal architecture that Damon himself had used, repeatedly, for his own protection. The irony was not lost on her. She signed everything Arthur put in front of her. When it was done, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. How long before he finds out? She asked. That depends on who he talks to and when, Arthur said. His financial team will notice movement in the joint accounts within days. Possibly sooner if they run a routine check. He's out of town until Sunday. Then you likely have until Monday. Tuesday at the outside. 4 days, possibly 5. She picked up her bag and stood. Then I have work to do, she said. She did not go back to the house that night. She had not planned this in advance, or rather, she had planned for it without fully admitting to herself that she was planning it. She had, over the course of the past week, made quiet arrangements. A friend from her years before Damon, a woman named Simone, who had an apartment in Astoria and who knew better than to ask too many questions all at once, had offered her the spare room. Nadia had not said yes or no at the time. She had said she'd let her know. She called Simone from Arthur's lobby. I need the room, she said. It's ready, Simone said immediately. No hesitation, no performance of surprise. You want me to come get you? No, I'll come to you. She took a car to Astoria. She had 2 bags with her. The leather tote with the documents and a second bag she'd packed that morning, with enough to last a week. She hadn't taken much. The things she needed most weren't objects. Simone met her at the door. She was a tall woman, angular, with a directness that had intimidated Nadia when they'd first met in their mid-20s, and that she now found enormously comforting. She looked at Nadia's face. She looked at her stomach. She said nothing except, "Soup's on the stove. Sit down." Nadia sat down. She ate soup. She did not cry that night either, though it came closer than it had before. Simone sat across from her at the small kitchen table, and they talked about nothing for an hour. Simone's job, a movie she'd seen, the way the neighborhood had changed in the past 2 years, and Nadia let the ordinary conversation move over her like water, over something that needed cooling, and by the time she went to bed in the spare room she felt, not better exactly, but less like she was about to come apart at the seams. She lay in the dark with her hands on her stomach, and the baby moved, a long, slow roll that she'd come to recognize as the movement her daughter made when she was settling in for the night, and Nadia thought, we're okay. We're going to be okay. She wasn't sure she believed it yet. But she thought it anyway. The weekend passed with the specific quality of time that exists when you are waiting for something inevitable. She met with Arthur once more on Saturday briefly to review the filing confirmations. Everything had processed cleanly. The protective measures were in place. The next step, the actual divorce papers, was prepared and ready. Arthur had a process server standing by. He was waiting only for her signal. She did not give it yet. She wanted Damon to come home first. She wanted him to walk back into the house and find it exactly as he'd left it. Dinner, perhaps. Normalcy. Nothing out of place. She wanted one more ordinary moment between them, not for sentiment. Not because she was wavering, but because she understood, in some instinctive way, that the contrast between that moment and what came next would matter. Not to him. To her. She needed to see with her own eyes whether he walked back through that door carrying any guilt at all. She needed to know, finally, exactly who she had married. She returned to the house on Sunday morning, early enough that the absence of 2 nights could be attributed to Simone's if Damon thought to check, which she doubted. He did not track her movements with any particular attention. He never had. She had spent 4 years being the one thing in his life he did not consider a variable. She cleaned the kitchen. She put fresh flowers in the entryway. She moved through the house with a calm that she recognized as the kind that arrives on the other side of a decision, not peace exactly, but resolution. The shaking uncertainty of the past 11 days had settled into something steadier and more purposeful, and she moved through each room without flinching. When she passed the study, she did not stop. She did not look at the fireplace. She went upstairs and stood in the nursery for the first time since the morning, after she'd overheard Damon's promise. She stood in the center of the room that smelled like fresh paint and new wood and the particular hope of something not yet arrived, and she put both hands flat against her stomach, and she said quietly, to the room, to her daughter, to herself, "This part is almost over." Damon came home Sunday evening. She heard his car. She heard the front door. She heard him move through the entry and set his keys on the hall table, the way he always did, a small, specific sound she had heard 10,000 times and would, she understood now, never hear again after a certain point that was arriving faster than she was entirely ready for. He came into the kitchen. He looked good, rested. The weekend had agreed with him. Of course it had. "Hey," he said. He kissed her cheek. Smelled like a hotel, that neutral, laundered smell. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," she said. "Back's been a little better." "Good." He was already moving to the refrigerator, already transitioning into the rhythms of home, as though he'd simply been on a business trip. Which, she supposed, from his perspective, he had. "Starving. Did you eat already? I was waiting for you." He turned and looked at her, then really looked at her, briefly, with something she might once have read as warmth. Now she read it as habit, the practiced warmth of a man performing a role he'd occupied so long he no longer noticed he was performing it. "I'll order something," he said. "What do you want?" "Whatever you want," she said. He ordered Thai food. They ate at the kitchen table. He talked about the meetings, the real meetings. She has assumed, since whatever else the weekend had contained it, had apparently also contained some actual business. She asked questions in the right places. She laughed once, briefly, at something he said that was genuinely slightly funny, and the laugh surprised her. Surprised her because it was real. Or at least real enough to be indistinguishable from the real thing. And she wasn't sure what that said about her. It said she decided that she had been doing this longer than the past 11 days. That the performance of ease over difficulty had been part of her life for longer than she'd admitted to herself. After dinner, he went to his study. She cleared the table. She stood at the sink and listened to the faint sound of him making phone calls through the closed study door. And she thought about what she was going to do. And she thought about the envelope that Arthur had prepared, the divorce papers, sealed. Her handwritten note folded inside, currently sitting at the bottom of her leather tote in the spare bedroom upstairs. Not yet. Not tonight. She needed one more day. Monday came in quietly. Gray sky, the threat of early snow that never quite arrived. Damon was in meetings all day, actual meetings, out of the house by 8, not expected back until evening. His schedule, which she had always had access to, through the shared calendar he maintained with his assistant, was fully blocked from morning until 6. She had until 6. She moved with precision. She went through the house, and she took what was hers, not everything, not even most things, but the things that were specifically and irreplaceably hers. The small wooden box from her dresser that contained her grandmother's jewelry. The photograph albums from the early years of her marriage, before she'd switched entirely to digital. A painting she'd bought herself, before Damon, at a street fair in the West Village when she was 25, and broke and had spent 2 weeks' grocery money on it because it had spoken to something in her she couldn't name. 3 books. A sweater Simone had given her that she'd always loved. Practical things. Clothes enough for several weeks, packed in 1 suitcase and 1 bag. She moved through the nursery last. She took nothing from there. She stood in the doorway and looked at the crib and the dresser and the small shelf of books they'd chosen together, and she thought, this room belongs to my daughter, not to my marriage. My daughter will still exist. This room will find her. She left it intact. She left the house at noon. She left her wedding ring on the nightstand beside the bed. She had considered, briefly, a more dramatic gesture, leaving it on the kitchen table, leaving it in the study, leaving it somewhere with some kind of weight to it. But in the end, she put it on the nightstand, because that was where she took it off every night before sleeping, and there was something honest in that. Something that said, this is where ordinary things end. This is where I was before. This is where I'm not anymore. She placed the sealed envelope beside it. She stood at the bedroom door and looked at the ring and the envelope for a long moment. The ring caught the pale winter light from the window and threw a small reflection onto the ceiling. She watched it for a second. Then she left. She was in Simone's by 12:30. She put her bags in the spare room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she pressed her hands together between her knees, and she sat there for a few minutes doing absolutely nothing, which was the most honest thing she'd done in weeks. Then her phone rang. It wasn't Damon, he wouldn't know yet, wouldn't be home for hours. It was Arthur. The secondary filing went through, he said. Everything's clean. When you're ready for the process server, just say the word. I already left, she said. A pause. You're out of the house? As of an hour ago. Another pause. Shorter. Okay. Are you somewhere safe? She looked around the spare room, the small shelf. The window with its view of the back of the building across the alley. The lamp with the crooked shade that Simone had been meaning to fix for 2 years. Yes, she said. I'm somewhere safe. Then I'll have the papers served tomorrow morning. She said, okay. She said, thank you. She hung up and sat in the quiet of Simone's spare room and thought about Damon coming home at 6 o'clock and finding the house silent and walking upstairs and finding the ring and the envelope on the nightstand. And she thought about his face, not with satisfaction, not with grief, but with something more complicated than either. She thought about what it would cost him to understand what he was looking at. She thought about whether he would understand it immediately or whether he would need a moment, the way she'd needed a moment, standing in the hallway outside his study, before the thing she was seeing became fully real. She thought about what it felt like to be the one who didn't know. She already knew what it felt like to be the one who did. Her phone buzzed at 6:47. She looked at the screen. Damon. She watched the phone ring. She watched his name on the screen, the name she'd programmed into her contacts 4 years after Gainax, 4 years ago, with a small heart after it that she'd removed about 8 months into the marriage when it had started to feel like something from a different era. Just his name now. Just letters. The call went to voicemail. He called again immediately. She watched that one go to voicemail too. Then a text, where are you? Call me. No punctuation in the message. His grammar always deteriorated when he was unsettled. She had noticed that years ago, filed it away as a small private piece of knowledge about the man she lived with, the kind of detail that accumulated over years of close proximity and that you only recognized as information rather than intimacy when intimacy was no longer the point. She put the phone face down on the bed. She lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of Simone's television. Through the wall, a cooking show. By the sound of it, someone enthusiastically describing something involving citrus, and she felt, slowly and with considerable effort, the particular sensation of a decision that was no longer reversible settling into her body like something physical. Like temperature. Like the moment in winter when you stop fighting the cold and just let yourself feel it. Her phone buzzed again. And again. She didn't look. In the house on East 74th Street, she knew Damon Vare was standing in a room that used to be their bedroom, holding a sealed envelope and a ring that caught the light and reflected it onto ceilings. And he was beginning to understand for perhaps the first time in his adult life that he had made a miscalculation so fundamental that no amount of leverage or information or power could reach backward in time and unmake it. He had believed, with the certainty of a man who had rarely been surprised, that Nadia would stay. Not because he deserved it. He had not thought in those terms. But because she always had. Because that was the arrangement as he understood it. because some part of him had confused permanence with passivity and assumed that the woman who had never fought him must therefore have nothing worth fighting for. He had been wrong. The phone buzzed a final time, then stopped, then started again a different contact. She looked at the screen. Bianca. She stared at that name for a long moment. Then she set the phone down without answering, without blocking, without doing anything at all. And she lay in the narrow spare bed in Simone's apartment in Astoria, with one hand on her stomach and the city noise coming through the window and the cooking show murmuring through the wall. And she thought, let him call her. Let him dial the number of the woman he promised everything to, and let him hear her voice, and let him feel in the precise moment when everything he thought he controlled has begun to slip exactly what kind of comfort that promise is worth now. Let him find out. Somewhere across the city, in a hotel room or an apartment on the Upper West Side, or wherever Bianca Sorrell was spending her Sunday evening, a phone was ringing. And the woman who answered it had no idea that the world she had been promised was already, in every way that mattered, gone. Bianca Sorrell answered on the third ring. Damon heard her voice and said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Damon? Bianca's voice carried that particular warmth she reserved exclusively for him, low, deliberate, the vocal equivalent of a hand reaching across a table. I've been trying to reach you all evening. Is everything? She's gone. A silence on the other end that told him she understood immediately what he meant. What do you mean gone? I mean, the house is empty and her ring is on the nightstand, and there's an envelope I haven't opened yet because... He stopped. He pressed his free hand flat against the bedroom wall and looked at the ring, catching the last of the evening light, and he said, with a flatness in his voice that didn't sound like him, because I think I already know what's in it. 6. Bianca said carefully, open it. He didn't move for a moment. Then he picked up the envelope. His name was written on the front, in Nadia's handwriting, neat, small, the letters slightly more compressed than her natural hand, the way her writing got when she was concentrating very hard on not showing anything. He had seen that handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards and the sticky notes she left on the refrigerator, and he had never once considered it a weapon. He opened it. The divorce papers were exactly what he'd expected. He moved through them without reading carefully. There would be time for that, time for lawyers and arguments, and the machinery of legal dissolution. He already knew they were coming. What he had not known, not entirely, was the scope. He scanned the asset schedules attached. He saw the accounts. He saw the property listings. He saw numbers that represented years of careful structural protection turned, with legal precision, into her leverage rather than his. Then he saw the note, one handwritten sentence on a small square of paper folded inside the papers. I heard you tell her she would become your wife. He stood very still. He stood still for a long time. Damon. Bianca's voice came through the phone he was still holding loosely at his side. Damon, talk to me. He put the phone to his ear. How long, he said. His voice was quiet, in a way that people who knew him well recognized as far more dangerous than loud. How long have you been in my house? A pause. What? When you came to the study, how many times before that night? How many times have you been in my house when I didn't, when Nadia was? He couldn't finish the sentence properly. Not because he was emotional. He was emotional because the question itself was shaping something in his understanding of the past several months, and the new shape was not one he'd anticipated. Damon, that's not... Answer me. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Counted them without meaning to. 4 times, Bianca said. Maybe 5. He closed his eyes. He had been careful. He had believed himself to be careful. He had turned his phone face down at breakfast. He had kept Bianca entirely separate from his domestic life, or so he had believed. He had brought her to the study because it was a controlled environment, a space Nadia never entered, on a day his security detail was running an errand and the house should have been reliably empty. Should have been. The single most consequential miscalculation of his adult life, and it had happened in his own home, in a room 30 feet from where his pregnant wife had apparently stood in the hallway and heard every word. Not apparently. Definitely, she had said so in 8 words. I heard you tell her she would become your wife. I need to call you back, he told Bianca. Damon, we should talk about. He hung up. He put the phone in his pocket. He sat on the edge of the bed, her side still faintly impressed from where she slept wet, the pillow still holding some arrangement of itself that belonged to her. And he looked at the divorce papers in his hands, and he thought, with the specific quality of cold that moves through a man when he realizes the trap has already closed, that he had fundamentally misread the only person in his life he had never considered reading. Called her. No answer. He called again. Nothing. He sent a text. Then another. Then he put the phone down and looked at the papers again, and found, in the attached documentation, the name of the attorney she'd used. Arthur Gaines. He didn't know the name. He ran through his mental catalog of every lawyer connected to anyone in his orbit, and the name produced nothing. She had found someone entirely outside his world, which meant she had been planning this for longer than one impulsive afternoon, which meant she had known and kept it from him, and moved through every breakfast and dinner and ordinary evening, with the knowledge sitting somewhere behind her eyes, and he had not seen it. He had not seen it because he had not been looking. He had been looking at Bianca. He picked up his phone and called Marcus, his most trusted lieutenant, a man who had been with him for 12 years, and who had, among other skills, an exceptional ability to find people who did not want to be found. Marcus answered immediately. "Boss, Nadia left," Damon said. "I need to know where she is." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it took Marcus to understand and assess the situation and adjust accordingly. "When?" "Today. She has 2 bags, maybe 3. She's 8 months pregnant. She doesn't drive in the city. She either took a car or someone picked her up." He paused. "She has a friend in Astoria. Simone, I don't have a last name." "Find it. Give me an hour. You have 30 minutes. He hung up and stood and walked to the window and looked out at East 74th Street in the dark, the cars moving below, the ordinary city indifferent and continuous. And he thought about Nadia sitting in the hallway outside his study, and he thought about what her face must have looked like, and the thought was, he pressed it down before it fully formed. Not yet. That particular reckoning was going to arrive on its own schedule. He couldn't afford it right now. He needed to find her first. Marcus called back in 22 minutes. Her name is Simone Achebe. She has an apartment on 33rd Street in Astoria, 2nd floor. I've got a car outside the building. Nadia Mercer arrived there approximately 1:45 this afternoon with 2 bags. She has not left. Damon was already moving toward the door. I'll go myself, he said. Boss. Marcus's voice shifted slightly. She's retained Arthur Gaines. I looked him up when you gave me the name. He's not the kind of attorney you negotiate around. He's the kind you take seriously. I know how to take attorneys seriously. I mean, she's taken steps, legal steps. The filings, some of them went through today, before you got home. The asset protection measures are all ready, Marcus. Yeah. Get the car. He stood outside Simone Achebe's apartment building for 40 seconds before going in. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold without a coat because he'd left the house without one, and he looked up at the lit window on the 2nd floor, and he thought about what he was going to say. He was not a man who improvised important conversations. He prepared. He understood leverage points, and he understood what the other person needed to hear, and he calibrated his delivery accordingly. It had always worked. It worked in boardrooms, and it worked in back rooms, and it had worked for 4 years in his marriage. He went inside. He knocked on the apartment door. It opened not Nadia, but Simone Achebe, tall and angular, with an expression so flat it was almost impressive. She looked at him the way you look at something you expected and are not remotely afraid of. Doesn't want to see you, Simone said. I need 5 minutes. She said you'd say that. Simone, she also said to tell you that she is aware of her legal rights and that if you have anything to communicate regarding custody or asset division, you should direct it to Arthur Gaines. She said this with the specific cadence of someone who had memorized it. Those are her words, not mine. Damon looked past her into the apartment, a small entryway, a kitchen visible beyond it, a lamp throwing warm light. He couldn't see Nadia, but he could feel her nearby, the way you feel the presence of something that has been yours for long enough that its proximity registers in your body before your eyes confirm it. She's 8 months pregnant, he said. Need to know she's fine. Simone's voice didn't soften. She's been fine. She's been handling this without you. She'll continue doing that. She started to close the door. Don't come back without calling Arthur Gaines first. The door closed. He stood in the hallway outside the closed door for a moment. He could hear, faintly, through the door, the sound of a television. Someone laughing at something on the screen. He stood there and listened to his wife watching television in a room 8 feet away, and he felt, with a clarity that he did not welcome, that the door between them was not the door in front of him. It had been closing for longer than tonight. It had been closing since the moment he'd made a decision that he'd believed was private and containable, and that had turned out to be neither. He went back downstairs. He sat in the car and told Marcus to take him home. He did not speak for the entire drive. Tuesday started badly and declined from there. His attorneys called at 8 in the morning. He'd sent them the divorce papers the night before, and they'd spent the night reviewing the attached documentation. The call was a conference of 4: his primary attorney, a tax specialist, a property lawyer, and the firm's litigation head, and the tone, which he recognized immediately, was the tone of men who were carefully managing the delivery of information they knew he was not going to receive well. The asset protection filings, said the litigation head, a man named Gregory Holt, who had been representing Damon for 9 years, and who had, in that time, never once sounded uncertain, are substantive. She's moved cleanly on the joint accounts. The Connecticut property is going to require. How did she know what to move? Damon asked. A pause. I'm sorry? She's not a lawyer. She doesn't have experience with this kind of asset structuring. Someone told her what to go after. Someone who understood how things were organized. He was quiet for a moment. She had inside's information. Gregory said carefully, it's possible. She simply had access to the documents and worked backward from. She had access to a home office with filing cabinets she never opened. She would have needed someone to tell her what she was looking at. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. Pull the account access logs. I want to know every login, every document view, every digital access from her phone or any device registered to her in the past 3 weeks. Gregory said he'd have it by afternoon. The call continued for another 40 minutes, detailing the exposure across 9 separate asset categories. Damon listened and asked questions and did not raise his voice once. He had a rule about that, about maintaining the flat, controlled register that communicated to people in rooms with him that the situation, however complicated, was still within the boundaries of what he could manage. He was not sure for the first time in a long time that it was. After the call, he poured coffee he didn't drink and stood in the kitchen and ran through the past 3 weeks in precise sequence, looking for the error, looking for where the membrane between his 2 slives had been punctured. He found it in less than 10 minutes. It wasn't the study. That was the original breach, and it was his fault, a lapse in schedule management, a convergence of bad timing that he should have controlled. But the study was the beginning, not the extent. The extent was everything that had happened after. The account he'd used for Bianca's apartment, it was technically clean, but it ran through a holding entity that was cross-referenced in the documents filed under Nadia's co-directorship. If she had access to those documents, and she clearly did, she would have found the transaction. She would have found the address. She had known about the apartment. She had known, and she had said nothing. And she had kept sitting across from him at breakfast and asking what he wanted for dinner, and telling him her back felt a little better, and she had known the entire time. He sat down at the kitchen table. He thought about who Nadia Mercer actually was. Not who he had married, the composed, careful woman who moved through his world without friction, who asked few questions and made fewer demands, who had always seemed, to him, to exist at a slight remove from the harsher elements of the life they shared. He understood now, confused quietness with passivity. He had assumed that her lack of visible reaction to difficult things meant she was not reacting. He had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they stop paying attention to something they believe is settled. She was not passive. She was methodical. She had sat with 11 days' worth of information and built a legal strategy and found an attorney outside his network and moved on his assets before he was home from the weekend he'd spent with Bianca. The weekend he'd left on with a kiss to her forehead, which he now recalled with a specific discomfort he chose not to examine too closely, and she had done all of it while being 8 months pregnant, and she had done it without making a single visible mistake. He had underestimated her so completely that the degree of it was almost difficult to quantify. His phone buzzed. "Marcus," he answered. "There's something else," Marcus said. Without preamble, without softening. In 12 years, Marcus had understood that Damon preferred information delivered without upholstery. The attorneys found it in the account access logs. There were login sessions from Nadia's personal tablet, 11 days of them. But 3 days before any of that, there was a single access from a different device. A phone not registered to anyone in your household. Damon went very still. "Whose phone?" "We're working on it." "It pinged a cell tower 2 blocks from your house." The access was brief, less than 4 minutes, but it went directly to the property holdings folder. The specific subfolder containing the Connecticut deed and the corporate directorship filings. 4 minutes. Someone who knew exactly where to look. Someone who had been in that house before. "Marcus." He stood up. His voice was still controlled, still flat. "Who has been in my home that I don't know about?" "I don't have an answer to that yet. Get one." He put the phone down on the table and looked at the kitchen. The kitchen he had lived in for 4 years. The kitchen where his wife had cooked and left coffee warming, and once laughed so hard at something he'd said that she'd had to set down her glass, and he thought about the photograph he'd found 2 days after Nadia's disappearance, in the drawer of the home office. His photograph, the one from his early 20s, the one he kept, because it was the last image he had from a period of his life he did not talk about. Moved 2 inches to the right of where it always sat. He had noticed and filed it away without analyzing it. He analyzed it now. She hadn't just accessed documents. She had gone through everything, systematically. She had been inside his private spaces, and she had looked at all of it, and she had taken the photograph out and put it back, and kept moving forward with her plan. And he had been sitting across from her at dinner while all of it was happening, and he had not seen any of it. He left the kitchen. He went to his study. He stood in the center of the room and looked at everything with the specific attention of a man trying to determine what has been touched. The filing cabinet was locked, as always. The bookshelf, he looked at it for a long moment. One book was slightly off from its neighbors. A reference book. Legal text on corporate structures, bought years ago, largely decorative at this point. Pulled it out. Inside the back cover was a handwritten index, his handwriting of account numbers and cross-references he'd used when setting up the shell company structure in the early years. A habit from before he'd trusted digital systems entirely. A habit he'd kept and forgotten about, more or less, because the information was no longer operationally necessary and the book had been sitting there for 6 years without anyone looking at it. The page markers were different, slightly. He would not have noticed if he hadn't been looking with this level of attention. She had found it. She had found the master key to the entire structural logic of his asset organization, and she had used it to move against him with a precision that, he had to admit with the particular honesty of a man who has been outmaneuvered, was more sophisticated than anything he'd expected from anyone who claimed to have had no prior knowledge of how his empire was organized. He stood there with the book in his hand. The question that arrived was one he didn't want to ask, because the answer changed everything about his current situation. But he asked it anyway, internally, with the unflinching rigor he applied to all problems of strategic consequence. Did she have help? Not Arthur Gaines. Gaines was reactive. He'd responded to information she brought, not generated intelligence independently. Not Simone Achebe, someone who had been in the house. Someone who had known where to look. Someone who had accessed those files from an unregistered phone in 4 minutes flat with no apparent search time. Someone who knew his system from the inside. He picked up his phone and called Marcus back. The phone, he said, "I need a name by tonight." Marcus's voice had something in it Damon didn't hear often. Something close to reluctance. "There's a possibility you're not going to like." "Tell me the cell tower." the timing of the access. The phone's data signature, we've been cross-referencing it. A pause that lasted 1 second longer than necessary. It matches a device that's been in and out of your network before. Not a stranger. Someone who's been in your house legitimately, multiple times. Damon waited. Marcus said a name, and Damon stood in his study, with the book in one hand and the phone in the other, and the name. Marcus had just said detonating quietly, in the center of everything. He thought he understood about his own operation. And the specific quality of cold that moved through him was not the cold of grief or betrayal in any ordinary sense. It was the cold of understanding that he had been strategically outmaneuvered, not by a stranger, not by a rival, not by anyone he'd ever classified as a threat. The name Marcus had given him was someone Damon had trusted. Someone with enough knowledge of his organizational structure to know where the relevant documents lived. Someone with enough access history to move through his network without triggering flags. Someone who had, apparently, decided at some point that Nadia Mercer's cause was worth more than his loyalty to Damon Vare. Someone who had chosen a side. "Are you certain?" Damon said. His voice was completely flat. 90%, Marcus said. "I want to run one more check before I do it fast." He hung up. He set the book on the desk. He set the phone beside it. He pressed both hands flat on the desktop and looked down at the surface and breathed in through his once, slowly, and thought about the architecture of the past month. About every conversation, every meeting, every moment he'd had any contact with the person whose name Marcus had just given him. He was looking for the seam, the moment the decision had been made, point at which loyalty had been quietly, invisibly withdrawn. He couldn't find it. That was the part that was hardest to sit with. Not the betrayal itself. He had lived his entire adult life in a world where betrayal was a baseline operational risk. What was hard to sit with was that he had not seen it. He who saw everything. He who had built an empire on the principle that information was the only reliable form of power. He had been seen through and moved against in his own house by his own wife, and he had not registered a single warning sign. Because he had been looking somewhere else. His phone rang. Not Marcus. Not Nadia. Bianca. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Her name sat there, with its accumulated weight, the promises he'd made, the apartment on the Upper West Side, the words he'd said beside the fireplace that had traveled through a 6-inch gap in a door and arrived at exactly the wrong pair of ears. He silenced the call. He sat down at his desk. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, Damon Vare had no immediate move to make. The legal process was engaged. Nadia was protected and unreachable on his terms. Someone inside his circle had helped her, and he would find out who, but finding out would not undo what was already done. The asset protection measures she'd moved were filed and processed and would require months of litigation to contest, and his own attorneys had communicated the odds of that litigation with the subdued professionalism of men who had. The name Marcus had given him was Daniel Reyes. Damon sat with that name for 12 hours before he did anything about it. 12 hours was not hesitation. It was not grief, though there was something adjacent to grief in it, the specific, arid feeling of realizing that a man you have eaten dinner with, argued with, trusted, with things that could destroy you, had looked at you across those dinners and those arguments and made a calculation you never detected. 12 hours was Damon being certain, absolutely, documentably certain, because what he did next could not be undone, and he did not act on 90%. He acted on certainty. Marcus delivered certainty at 7 in the morning. The second trace confirmed. The access timestamp matched a window when Daniel had been in the house for a meeting, a routine meeting, one of dozens they'd had in that study over the years. The document trail was clean but not clean enough. Daniel had pulled the corporate structure files, photographed them with his phone, and sent them through an encrypted messaging app to a number that, when Marcus traced it backward through 2 routing layers, resolved to a prepaid device purchased in cash at a pharmacy on 86th Street 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, Zemo. The same week Damon had bought Bianca the apartment. He sat with the timeline. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over something sharp enough to cut you, carefully, aware that you're going to feel it either way. Daniel had known about Bianca for longer than the study. The question was how. The answer, when he found it 40 minutes later in the access logs Marcus had pulled, was simple and devastating. Daniel had been in the study 3 months ago for a meeting that ran long. Damon had stepped out to take a call. He had left his phone on the desk. One notification, from Bianca, the kind of notification that was on its own, ambiguous. But Daniel was not a man who needed much. He was precise and patient, and he had apparently spent 3 months deciding what to do with what he knew. And then Nadia had come home early one afternoon, and the decision had been made for him. He had chosen her. Damon called him at 7:15. Daniel answered on the second ring, which told Damon immediately that he'd been awake. Possibly all night. I need you at the office, Damon said. 8 o'clock. A pause. 1 second. I'll be there. He hung up. He got dressed. He drank the coffee that had been sitting on the counter since 6, and he felt it move through him like something metallic, and he put on his coat, and he thought about what this conversation was going to require of him. He thought about 12 years. He thought about the specific weight of 12 years of trust and what it cost to find out that weight had been redistributed without your knowledge. He thought about Nadia, sitting in Simone's spare room, while his empire quietly and methodically turned against him. He drove to the office himself. Daniel was already there when Damon arrived. He was standing by the window in the conference room, not sitting, which told Damon he'd prepared himself for this. He was 41 years old, compact, with the kind of stillness that in another life might have made him a good poker player. He was wearing the same jacket he'd worn to every meeting for the past year, the dark gray one with the worn left cuff, and his hands were in his pockets, and he was looking out at the Manhattan skyline with an expression that Damon had seen before on men who had already accepted the consequences of what they'd done. Damon closed the door. He didn't sit either. They stood on opposite sides of the conference table and looked at each other, and the room was very quiet, and the morning light came through the window at a low angle and threw long shadows across the floor between them. How long? Damon said. Daniel didn't pretend not to understand the question. I found out about Bianca in September. I've known about the document access. I know what you know. I'm asking how long you knew and chose not to tell me. Daniel looked at him directly. 3 months. 3 months. Yes. Damon pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because he was tired. Because sitting across from a standing man was a power inversion that communicated precisely that he was entirely in control of this room and this conversation, regardless of what Daniel had done. Tell me why, he said. Daniel pulled his hands out of his pockets. He looked at them briefly, as though checking that they were still there. Then he looked back at Damon. Because she was pregnant. Because you were going to throw her out of her own life while she was carrying your child. Because I sat across from her at your Christmas dinner last year and watched the way she looked at you and knew she didn't have any idea what was coming, and He stopped. He reset. Because it was wrong. The word wrong sat in the room between them like something dropped. You've worked for me for 12 years, Damon said. In 12 years, you've seen things that were considerably worse than a man ending his marriage. You didn't use that word then. This was different. Why? Daniel's jaw tightened. Because it was Nadia. Damon was quiet for a moment. You're in love with her, he said. Not an accusation, a data point. Daniel's expression shifted, not guilty exactly, but honest, in a way that didn't need verbal confirmation. He said, that's not why I did it. I don't particularly care why you did it. I care that you did it. I care that for 3 months you sat in my meetings and ate at my table and handled my business, and all of it was performance. All of it was cover for a decision you'd already made. Damon leaned forward slightly. Do you understand what that makes you, Daniel? I understand what it makes me to you. And you did it anyway. Yes. Damon sat back. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city moved in its morning rhythm. A siren somewhere, the low percussion of traffic, the world entirely uninterested in the specific ruination happening in this conference room. Clean out your desk, Damon said. Everything you're owed will be transferred by end of day. You'll receive documentation releasing you from all contractual obligations, including the non-disclosure provisions. He paused. If you contact Nadia, if you involve yourself in anything connected to my legal situation or my daughter's life, that release disappears, and I will take every legal avenue available to. Do you understand? Daniel looked at it for a moment. That's it? What did you expect? He stopped, looked at the window, looked back. More. You helped the mother of my child protect herself legally. You did it in a way that was disloyal, and I won't forget it. But you didn't, he paused, choosing the precise word. You didn't cross a line that requires more than this. He stood. Get out of my office, Daniel. Daniel picked up his phone from the table. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle, and he turned back, and his expression had shifted again into something Damon couldn't immediately read, not remorse, not defiance, something in between. She came home that night to show you something, Daniel said. That night in the study, she told Simone the baby had kicked hard enough to feel from the outside for the first time. She wanted you to feel it. That's why she was home early. Damon said nothing. I thought you should know that, Daniel said. Whatever you do with it. He left. Damon stood alone in the conference room for 4 minutes, which was longer than he'd stood still, and done nothing in longer than he could remember. And he thought about a woman, at months, pregnant, carrying takeout bags through a side entrance because the front door stuck in cold weather, and he thought about what she'd been going to do when she found him, the ordinary, hopeful, entirely unremarkable thing she'd been going to do, and the thought arrived fully formed, and he could not press it down this time. He sat back down. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He stayed that way for a while. The next 3 weeks were the kind of time that accumulates without feeling like it's moving. Damon went through the legal machinery with the focused efficiency of a man who has survived worse and knows how to compartmentalize. He met with Gregory Holt twice a week. He reviewed every document. He made strategic concessions early on the assets that were cleanly hers to avoid protracted litigation on the ones that were genuinely contested. He was reasonable in a way that surprised his own legal team, who had prepared for a war and received instead a man who seemed primarily interested in arriving at resolution. What he was not doing, and what his legal team did not know, was that the reasonableness had nothing to do with strategy. He was being reasonable because fighting her on the money felt, in the most private part of himself, that he allowed to be honest, like the wrong response to what had happened. She had not done anything that was not within her legal rights. She had protected herself because he had given her every reason to believe she needed protection. The machinery she had used against him, he had built it himself, structured it himself, placed it under her name himself. If it now functioned as her armor, rather than his, the fault was architectural. The fault was his. He did not experience this as nobility. It was just accuracy. What he could not manage, despite every effort, was the weight. He was not permitted to see her. Arthur Gaines had established clear parameters, no direct contact, outside of formal legal channels until the divorce was finalized. His attorneys communicated with hers. He received updates about her health through formal correspondence, which was an experience so strange and dehumanizing that the first time he'd read the phrase Mrs. Mercer Vare is in good health, and the pregnancy is progressing normally, he'd had to put the document down and walk away from it for an hour. Mrs. Mercer Vare, in good health. The pregnancy progressing normally. His daughter was progressing normally inside a woman he was not allowed to speak to, in a city he moved through every day without finding her, and the distance was self-inflicted, and he knew it, and it did not make the distance smaller. He dismantled the apartment on the Upper West Side. He called Bianca on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the night he'd stood outside Simone's building, and he told her simply and without extended explanation that it was over. Completely. That he would not be in contact again. That the apartment's remaining lease would be handled by his property manager and she should vacate by the end of the month. Bianca said, "You're doing this because she left. I'm doing this because I should have done it before she had reason to." "That's not the same as loving me," so he said. "It isn't." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then Bianca said quietly, You never actually thought about what it would cost her, did you? When you made all those promises, he didn't answer. She's stronger than you thought she was, Bianca said. It wasn't cruel. It was just true. Most people are, when you leave them no choice. She hung up first. He set his phone on the desk and looked at it for a moment and thought, she's right about that last part. Call from Arthur Gaines came on a Wednesday morning in the 7th week. My client has agreed to a meeting, Gaines said, in my office. This Friday, she's asked me to communicate that it is not a negotiation regarding legal matters. Those are proceeding separately. She wants to speak with you directly. Once, Damon's hand tightened on the phone. She's all right. She's due in approximately 2 weeks. Her health is good. The meeting, if you agree, will be brief and will occur with me present. I'll be there. He was in Arthur Gaines's office 40 minutes early on Friday morning. He sat in the small waiting area with a coffee he didn't touch, and he thought about what she was going to say, and he thought about what he was going to say, and he discarded most of it, because he had learned, in the past 7 weeks, that prepared responses required an understanding of who you were talking to, and he no longer had the confidence that he understood Nadia Mercer the way he'd believed he did. She arrived 20 minutes after him. He heard her in the corridor before she came in. Her footsteps, slower than he remembered, the particular careful pace of late pregnancy, something he had never paid close enough attention to when he'd had the opportunity. Then the door opened. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had cut her hair shorter than it had been, just at the jaw. She was wearing a coat he didn't recognize. She looked, physically, the way you look when you have spent 7 weeks, being very tired and very determined, simultaneously drawn around the eyes, precise in her movements. Posture of someone who has been holding themselves together through sustained effort and has gotten good at it. She looked like herself, more so, somehow, than he could recently remember. She sat across from him at Arthur's small conference table. Arthur sat at the head. Nobody offered pleasantries. I agreed to this meeting, Nadia said, because there are things I want to say to you direct, not through attorneys, not in writing. Her voice was steady. She had clearly been steady for a long time, and she was going to stay that way. And because after this, I don't want there to be anything unsaid between us that could come out wrong later, in front of our daughter. He nodded. I know what you've been doing legally, she said. Your team has been less difficult than I expected. I want you to know that I noticed. It doesn't change anything between us, but it matters for what comes after, for Alara, and I noticed. He said, I know what you're owed. I'm not interested in fighting you on it. She looked at him for a moment. Good. Then she folded her hands on the table, and she looked at him with those dark, careful eyes, and she said, Tell me what you were thinking. Not with Bianca. I know what you were thinking with Bianca. She paused, recalibrated. The night I came home. The night I heard you. What was in your head when you said those words to her? I need to understand whether you knew, whether any part of you registered that I was having our daughter. That I was in the last weeks of carrying a child you said you wanted. Whether that was present anywhere in what you were doing in that room. The question was quiet, not accusatory. Genuinely inquiring, the way someone asks a question they've spent a long time wanting answered and have finally earned the right to ask. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked back at her. No, he said. It wasn't present. That's the honest answer. He stopped, started again. I'd stopped thinking about you as someone I could hurt. I'd started thinking about you as someone who would always be there regardless. And the difference between those two things is, that's the whole of it, Nadia. That's the whole of what I did wrong, not just Bianca. She looked at him for a long time. Thank you, she said, for saying it like that. It doesn't fix it. No, it doesn't. She uncrossed her hands. But it means our daughter isn't going to grow up, watching her parents lie about what happened between them, which is the only thing I was worried about. He said, I want to be in her life, whatever that looks like under the terms you set. I know you do. She said it without warmth, but also without cruelty. I'm not going to use her to punish you. That's not who I am. I know, he said. I know who you are. He paused. I just didn't know it well enough. Something else crossed her face, brief, unreadable, gone before he could identify it. She shifted in her chair. She put one hand on her stomach, an unconscious gesture he recognized from the past 8 months of watching it become automatic. She looked down at her hand for a second, then back up. "There's something I want you to know," she said, "and I want you to understand that I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because I've been carrying it, and I need to put it down." He waited. "The night I came home early," she said. "I came because the baby had kicked hard enough to feel from the outside for the first time. She'd been moving all day, but that afternoon it was different, strong enough that I knew you'd be able to feel it. I wanted," she stopped. Her jaw tightened fractionally. "I wanted to find you and put your hand on my stomach and have you feel your daughter move for the first time." She looked at him directly. "That's what I came home for." The room was completely quiet. "While I was standing in the hallway," she said, "listening to you promise her your name." She stopped, breathed. Alara was moving. Under my hand. She kicked twice while I stood there. He said nothing. He had no architecture for this. No leverage, no preparation, no version of himself that knew how to sit inside this particular fact and remain composed. He pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them and felt moving through him like something structural giving way, the full and irreversible weight of what he had lost. Not the assets, not the marriage in legal terms, the moment. That specific, unrepeatable, ordinary moment, a woman coming home through a side entrance with takeout bags because the front door stuck in cold weather, wanting to find her husband so he could feel their daughter move for the first time. That moment was gone. It had been happening while he was in the next room, making a promise to another woman, and it was gone. And no amount of anything, money, power, legal concession, time could reach back into that hallway and give it to him. His vision blurred slightly. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye briefly and said nothing. Nadia watched him. She did not comfort him. She was not cold about it. She simply watched. The way you watch someone receive information you've been holding for a long time and finally delivered, and you feel the complicated mix of relief and grief that comes with putting down something that was never yours to carry alone. She said quietly, "I needed you to know that." "I know," he said. His voice was not entirely even. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded once. She looked at Arthur, who had been present and silent through all of it with the particular professional stillness of a man who understood when his function was to witness rather than intervene. "I think that's what I needed," she said. She moved to stand. "Nadia." She paused. He looked at her, at this woman he had married and deceived and underestimated and lost, who was 2 weeks from giving birth to his daughter and was sitting across from him with more dignity and composed strength than anyone he had ever faced, across any table in any room. He looked at her, and he thought about everything he wanted to say and understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that most of it was too late, and the rest of it was for him and not for her. He said, "I'm sorry. For what it's worth." She stood fully. She picked up her bag. She looked at him with those dark, careful eyes, and what was in them was not forgiveness, and was not hatred, and was not love, and was not its absence. It was something more complicated than any of those things, something that had been through 11 days of silence, and 7 weeks of legal machinery, and 1 pregnancy, and 4 years of marriage, and 1 night in a hallway, and it had come out the other side of all of that as something that didn't have a simple name. "I know you are," she said. She walked to the door. She opened it, and Damon Vare, who had built his life on the certainty that power meant never losing anything you decided to keep, sat at Arthur Gaines's small conference table and watched the door close and understood, with a finality that settled into his bones like winter, that some things cannot be kept by deciding to keep them. Some things can only be kept by choosing them, every day, before they're gone. He had not chosen, and the door had closed. And in 2 weeks, in a hospital somewhere in this city that was still moving and indifferent outside the window, his daughter was going to arrive into a world that her parents had already divided, and he was going to meet her on the terms Nadia set. And those terms were the only terms left, and they were entirely fair, and they were the consequence of everything he had done and everything he had failed to do, and he was going to have to learn to live inside. He learned to live inside it, the way you learn to live inside any wound that doesn't close cleanly. Not by forgetting, not by replacing it with something easier, but by waking up every morning and deciding, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has no remaining illusions about his own nature, to be present inside the consequences of what he had done. That was all. That was the whole of what was available to him, and he took it. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in January, 42 days after Nadia had walked out of Arthur Gaines's small conference room and closed the door. It was processed without drama, without courtroom theatrics, without the kind of protracted legal warfare that Gregory Holt had initially prepared for and then quietly stood down from when it became clear that Damon intended to be, on the subject of Nadia Mercer's financial future, almost entirely reasonable. Almost entirely, because there were 2 points he contested. Not the money, not the property. He contested the language in the custody arrangement that would have given him visitation on a schedule that felt to him like visiting a stranger. He sat with Gregory in the conference room, and he said, without anger, that he understood he had forfeited a great deal, but that he was not going to accept a legal document that made him a quarterly event in his daughter's life. He said it once. He said it flat and clear and without elaboration. And Gregory, who had known him for 9 years and recognized the difference between the kind of statement that was an opening position and the kind that was a wall, went back to Arthur Gaines with it. It took 6 days of back and forth. Arthur communicated Nadia's position, which was not vindictive, but was careful in the way of a woman who had learned, specifically and recently, the cost of insufficient carefulness. What she wanted was structure, consistency, a predictable presence rather than an overwhelming one. She was not trying to minimize Damon's role. She was trying to define it clearly enough that Alara would never feel the instability of a father whose participation depended on his schedule or his mood. He agreed to the structure. He agreed to all of it. He signed the final document on a Thursday morning with Gregory sitting beside him and a notary across the table, and the pen felt heavier than it should have, and he signed his name in the clean, deliberate hand he'd always had. And when it was done, he sat for a moment in the quiet of the conference room with the signed documents in front of him, and he thought, this is the right thing. This is the correct outcome. He had done wrong, and this was the consequence of it. And the consequence was fair, and fair was not comfortable, but it was what he had available. He stood up. He thanked Gregory. He went home to the house on East 74th Street that was, he had decided, going to be sold. Not immediately, but it was going to be sold. He could not locate a version of himself that was willing to keep living in the place where the most consequential failure of his adult life had happened. While convincing himself it was just a house. Alara Veer was born on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January. He got the text from Simone Achebe, of all people, at 6:47 in the morning. It was 3 words, she's here, healthy, and then a second text, 12 minutes later a single photograph. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the photograph for a long time. She was very small, very red. Her face was scrunched with the specific indignation of someone who has just been introduced to a world she did not request. She had a full head of dark hair, visible even in the photograph, and she was wrapped in a white blanket with her mouth slightly open and her hands curled into fists at the sides of her face, which was he touched the screen briefly with one finger, which was his face. The shape of the jaw, the brow, his face miniaturized and made new and delivered into the world through a woman he had wronged, and she was here and she was healthy and she was his daughter. He put the phone down. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He sat there in the gray January morning light of a house that was going to be sold, and he breathed through it, all of it, the grief and the gratitude and the complicated, unnavigable love for something he had not yet held, and he gave himself exactly 7 minutes to simply feel it without managing it, without strategy, without the controlled register of a man who has decided how things are going to go. Then he got up. He showered. He dressed. He called Arthur Gaines's office and left a message to be passed to Nadia, through the formal channels, that he had received the news and that whenever she was ready and under whatever terms she chose, he would like to meet his daughter. He went to work. He came home that evening and cooked himself dinner, which he almost never did. He was a functional cook in the way that a man who grew up with an absent mother and an unreliable household learns to be functional at most things. Not well, but competently. He made pasta. He ate it standing at the counter. He washed the dish. He was aware, in a low and steady way that had been with him for weeks, that something in the internal architecture of Damon Vare was in the process of changing. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in the stories that men told themselves about transformation, the single moment of revelation, the clean break, the before and after with a bright line between them. It was slower than that and less articulate. It was waking up and signing legal documents and going to work and cooking pasta and going to sleep and waking up again. And somewhere in the repetition of that ordinary sequence, the man who had built an empire on the premise that he was exempt from the consequences of his own decisions was being replaced, gradually, with a man who understood that he was not. It was not a comfortable transition. It was, he thought, the only honest one available. He met Alara for the first time on a Saturday, 11 days after she was born. Nadia had communicated through Arthur that she was ready. The meeting was at Simone's apartment in Astoria, which Nadia had been staying in since touched her from the house, and apparently intended to keep staying in until she found her own place. He arrived at the agreed time, not early, with nothing he had considered bringing something, and had decided against it. Had decided that arriving with gifts to his own daughter's introduction felt like performing generosity rather than having it. And he was trying, with considerable effort, to stop performing and start just being whatever he actually was. Simone opened the door. She looked at him the way she had the night he'd stood in this hallway, 3 months ago, flat, unsurprised, entirely undramatized by his presence. She stepped aside without comment and let him in. Nadia was in the living room. She was sitting in the corner of the small couch, with Alara against her chest, the baby facing outward, held secure against her mother with a practiced ease that told him they had already, in 11 days, developed a fluency together. Nadia looked up when he came in. She did not stand. She did not smile, but she was not cold either. She looked at him with that direct, careful regard that he had spent 4 years reading as composure, and now understood was also, and always had been, assessment. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. He came further into the room. He stopped a few feet away and looked at his daughter. Alara was awake. Her eyes were the unfocused dark blue of all newborns, moving in the imprecise way of eyes that were still learning what to do with light. Her head was turned slightly to the side, resting against Nadia's collarbone. Her mouth was making small movements, not crying, not feeding, just existing, processing, discovering by increments the texture of the world she had recently arrived in. He had held his share of children over the years. Colleagues' kids, brothers-in-law, the children of men he'd done business with. He had never found it particularly affecting. He had assumed this would be different in degree. He had not understood it would be different in kind. He sat down on the edge of the armchair across from Nadia. His hands hung between his knees. He looked at Alara. "She looks like you," Nadia said. "She looks like both of us. The jaw is yours. The ears are yours." Nadia looked down at the baby, and there was something in her face then quiet, involuntary, private expression of a woman looking at something she loves with the specific intensity that comes from having paid for it with difficulty. And he looked away from it because it was not for him. "You can hold her," Nadia said, "if you want." He looked at her. She was watching him with that careful regard. She was giving him this not as a gift, not as a concession, but as what it simply was, the first meeting between a father and his daughter, which was a thing that existed outside the damage between the two adults and belonged to neither of them to withhold. He held out his hands. Nadia transferred Alara with the practiced efficiency of 11 days' experience, one hand supporting the head, the weight of her redistributing into his arms so naturally that his body knew what to do before his mind confirmed it. Alara settled against him with a small sound that was not protest and was not contentment, and was simply the sound of adjusting to new coordinates. He looked down at her. She turned her head toward him, not seeing him. Not yet, her vision was not there yet, but turning toward warmth. Turning toward presence. He put one finger into the curve of her curled fist, and she gripped it, reflexively, with a strength that was startling, and he felt, moving through his chest like something physical, the specific and unmistakable sensation of his life, rearranging itself around a new gravitational center. He looked up at Nadia. She was watching him. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be sufficient. He looked back down at Alara and he thought, here you are. Here is what I was failing to protect when I was looking somewhere else. Here is the consequence of being found by something you haven't earned and the responsibility of not failing it again. He held her for 20 minutes. When Nadia took her back for feeding, he sat quietly in the armchair, and the three of them occupied the small living room in Simone's apartment in Astoria, with a silence that was not comfortable and was not hostile, and was something more specific than either the silence of people who share something irreducible and are learning to exist inside that shared thing without the framework they thought it would come with. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and looked at Nadia and said, "Thank you for this." She looked at him steadily. She deserves her father. That's not about you and me, I know. Thank you anyway. He walked out into the January afternoon. He stood on the sidewalk outside Simone's building, and he breathed the cold air in for a moment. The street was ordinary around him, a child on a bicycle, someone walking a dog, the sound of a radio through an open window somewhere above. The city, its indifferent and continuous life. He walked to his car. He sat in it for a while, without starting it. He was thinking about what it meant to begin again, inside a life that had not reset, a life that carried all of its history intact, all of its damage visible, all of its consequences still unfolding, and to decide, in that life, to be different, not because the situation demanded it, but because you had finally understood the difference between what you had built and what you had believed you were building. He started the car. He drove back to Manhattan through the gray January afternoon, and he thought about his daughter's fist closing around his finger, and he drove. The house on East 74th Street sold in March. He moved into a smaller apartment in Tribeca, not a statement, not an austerity, simply a place that was his, without the weight of a history he was trying to stop living inside. He took almost nothing from the house. The furniture went to auction. The painting that had hung in the living room for 3 years went with it, because it had been chosen by a decorator to represent a version of his life that no longer fit, and he had never particularly liked it anyway. He took his books. He took the photograph from his desk drawer, the one Nadia had found, and replaced 2 inches to the right and never mentioned. He took his clothes and his coffee equipment and a lamp he'd had since his first apartment in his 20s that he kept for no reason he could articulate except that it had been there through everything. He kept the lamp on his desk in the new apartment. He found himself, in the weeks following the move, in a version of his life that was quieter than any version he'd occupied since his early 20s. The empire continued. It was not the kind of thing that required his emotional clarity to function, only his operational attention, and that he provided. He made decisions. He managed his people. He sat in rooms where men needed something from him, and he gave them what he had to give. And he came home to the Tribeca apartment, and he cooked or he ordered food, and he sat with his own company in a way he had never previously had to learn, because he had never previously lived alone, in the way he was living alone. Now not the aloneness of a man temporarily between relationships, but the aloneness of a man who has looked honestly at himself and decided that the next thing, whatever it is, cannot be rushed into simply to fill the silence. The silence had something to teach him. He was learning to sit inside it long enough to hear what it was saying. He saw Alara every week. Initially, the visits were at Simone's apartment, Nadia present. The formal structure of the custody arrangement, observed with the careful precision of 2 people who understood that the structure was not a cage, but a container, something to hold the thing steady while it found its shape. He arrived at the agreed time, and he stayed for the agreed duration, and he was present, specifically present, in a way he had not previously understood was a skill and not an instinct. It was a skill. He practiced it. He learned the pitch of Alara's different cries. He learned the specific weight of her when she was falling asleep against his chest, which was different from the weight of her when she was awake and interested in the world, which was different again from the weight of her when she was upset and needed settling. He learned what settling her required, which was motion. She liked motion. She liked to be walked. She liked the specific rhythm of a pace slightly faster than comfortable, which Nadia told him wryly was a personality trait she suspected came from his side. He laughed at that. Nadia almost smiled. They were building, in the space between them, something that had no clean name. Not friendship, not the residue of a marriage. Something more functional and, in its way, more honest than either a co-parenthood that had been stripped of every pretense and was therefore, paradoxically, more genuine than much of what had come before. Nadia did not forgive him. He did not ask her to. He understood that forgiveness was not the transaction on offer, and that expecting it would be a way of making her difficulty into something that existed to serve his emotional accounting. And he had done enough of that. What she gave him instead was consistency. She communicated clearly. She followed through on what she said. She brought Ilara to the agreed exchanges, and she was present without being warmly present, civil without being cordial. And it was exactly what it was, the behavior of a woman who has decided that the right thing for her child is more important than her own comfort, and who is doing it with the competence and controlled difficulty of someone who has paid for that decision with real grief and is not going to pretend otherwise. He respected it. He tried to match it. In April, Nadia found her apartment. It was in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood she had looked at years ago, before Damon's world had made certain calibrations to what her life looked like. It was a two-bedroom on the fourth floor of a building, with an elevator, with windows that faced south and caught light from mid-morning onward. And it had a second bedroom that was the right size for a child, and that she painted herself not the careful professional job she and Damon had done in the East 74th nursery, but the slightly uneven work of a woman doing it alone, with a roller and a tray of pale yellow paint, and a baby and a bouncer on the floor beside her, watching with the focused attention that babies devote to everything, as though the universe has just invented it. She painted it in a weekend. It was not perfect. It was hers. She moved the furniture from the storage unit she'd been paying for since January, and she set up Ilara's crib, and she made the bed with sheets she'd bought new, not because she was making a statement about starting over, but simply because she wanted sheets that had no previous context. Sheets that belonged to this apartment and this chapter, and nothing that came before, and she sat on the edge of the new bed, in the new apartment in the evening, after Ilara was asleep, and she looked at the south-facing window, and the city visible through it, and she thought, this is mine. This is specifically and actually mine, built from what I knew and what I protected and what I refused to lose. It was not triumphant, exactly. The movies would have made it triumphant. The music swelling, the protagonist finally standing in her own space with tears of cathartic relief. It was quieter than that. It was the specific satisfaction of a woman who spent 11 days in her own house not knowing who she was in it, and who had spent the subsequent months building an answer to that question, and who now sat on the edge of a bed in a room that was the physical form of that answer. The satisfaction was real. So was the tiredness. So was the specific low-frequency grief of a life that had been something else and was now something different, and the knowledge that the something different was better and more honest did not entirely eliminate the loss of the something else. Both things were true. She held both of them. She got up. She checked on Ilara. She went to bed. Simone came over for dinner the following week. They ate takeout Thai food, which Nadia had barely been able to smell during her first trimester, and which she had missed with a specificity that made her laugh at herself. And Ilara slept in the bouncer between them on the kitchen floor, the way she slept through most things, with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned that the world contains things to be anxious about. They ate and talked about nothing important for a while. Simone's job, a movie she'd seen, the way the new neighbor played music at a volume that stopped just short of actionable. Then Simone said, "How are you actually doing?" Nadia ate a bite of pad thai. Thought about the question. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired in a way that I think is going to last for a while. But under the tired, She looked at the window. "Look back. I'm okay. I mean that. I'm not saying it to close the question." Simone watched her. Daniel asked about you. Nadia was quiet for a moment. He shouldn't. I know, I told him that. He wanted to know you were okay. Tell him I'm okay. She put her fork down. And Simone. Tell him that what he did was… She stopped, thought about it. Tell him it mattered. What he did. Tell him I know it cost him something. And I know why he did it, and I tell him it mattered. Simone nodded. She didn't push further. That was one of the things about Simone. She understood the difference between the questions that were invitations and the ones that were walls. And she had always known which was which. They finished dinner. Simone helped wash up. She held Alara for a while before she left, with the practiced ease of someone who had been present for the past weeks, in the way that matters not dramatically, not with speeches, but with soup and space and a spare room kept ready. At the door, Nadia hugged her. Simone said into her hair, "You did good." Nadia pulled back. Her eyes were wet, not crying, or not quite. "I had help. You did the work." She couldn't argue with that. She closed the door. She stood in her hallway, and she listened to Alara breathing through the baby monitor on the counter, and she thought about the word work and all the ways it applied and all the ways it didn't capture it. And she thought about the woman she had been in that other hallway, 14 weeks ago, standing outside a study door with one hand over her mouth and the other on her stomach. And she thought about what that woman had done next, and what it had cost, and what it had produced. And she thought, that woman was me. That was not someone else's courage. That was mine, and I get to keep it. She went to check on Alara one more time. The baby was asleep on her back, with her arms thrown up on either side of her head, the attitude of someone who has simply decided to trust the floor to be there. Her breathing was even and soft and small. Nadia stood in the doorway for a long moment and looked at her daughter in the pale yellow room with its slightly uneven walls, and the light from the hallway falling in a soft stripe across the crib, and something in her chest that had been tight for a very long time quietly let go. Not all of it. Enough. In May, Damon asked, through Arthur Gaines's office, whether Nadia would be open to adjusting the visitation terms, not to increase his time, but to simplify the logistics. Alara was 4 months old and mobile enough that the formality of managed exchanges was beginning to feel, for the child's sake, like an unnecessary structure. He proposed a less formal arrangement, direct communication, reasonable flexibility, the kind of co-parenting that required the two of them to talk to each other like adults rather than routing everything through attorneys. Nadia thought about it for 3 days. She called Arthur and told him she was agreeable in principle and wanted to try it for 60 days before making it official. Arthur communicated this to Damon's office. The first direct communication between them, since Arthur's conference room, was a text message from Damon that said, "Thursday pickup, 10 a.m. I'll bring her back by 5. Does that work? She looked at the message for a moment. The directness of it, the simplicity. He was not performing ease, he was just being functional, which was, she understood, the version of him that she could work with. She typed back, "Works. She needs to eat at noon. I'll send food." He replied, "Got it." That was it. It was not a reconciliation. It was not warmth. It was two people who shared a daughter and a history, and the specifically adult task of navigating both without making the child pay for the damage. And they were doing it, and the doing of it was unremarkable and small and ordinary, which was exactly what it needed to be. The first time they were in a room together without attorneys or Simone or formal arrangement was in June, at Alara's pediatrician appointment. He was already there when Nadia arrived early, which she noted, which was consistent with a pattern she's observed in the past months of him being precise about the things he committed to. She came in with Alara in the carrier against her chest, and he stood up from his chair in the waiting room, and there was a brief, specifically human moment of spatial negotiation. Do we hug? Do we shake hands? Do we do neither? What is the correct physical language for two people who were married and are not, and share a 4-month-old? And they resolved it by both of them simply turning toward Alara, who was awake and looking at her father, with the focused dark eyes that had developed, in 4 months, from newborn blur, into something genuinely observant. Alara looked at Damon. Damon looked at Alara. She reached toward him. It was an imprecise, uncoordinated gesture. She could not yet control her hands well enough to direct them accurately, but the intention was clear enough. Reaching, he put his finger against her palm. She gripped it. He looked up at Nadia. She was watching. Her expression was, he had learned, in the past months, to read her expressions more carefully than he had in 4 years of marriage. Having discovered that the cost of not reading them was higher than he'd known, her expression was not soft exactly, but it was open, present, not guarded. She's been reaching for things this week, Nadia said. Everything. She tried to grab the spoon yesterday. Smart, he said. Stubborn, Nadia said. She wants what she wants. He looked back at Alara. Yeah, he said. I wonder where she gets that. Nadia made a sound that was, if not quite a laugh, in the direction of one. They went in for the appointment. They sat on opposite sides of the exam table, while the pediatrician, a brisk woman named Dr. Osei, who had the specific warmth of someone who delivers reassurance as efficiently as information, ran through Alara's 4-month milestones. Weight gain, good. Motor development, tricking well. Social responses, she noted, demonstrating, the way Alara turned toward familiar voices ahead of where they expected. She's responsive, Dr. Osei said. She looked at both of them. She knows her people. Nadia glanced at Damon briefly. He was looking at Alara. Yeah, Nadia said. She does. That evening, after the appointment, after Damon had driven them back to Brooklyn and unloaded the stroller with the functional efficiency of a man who had learned in 3 months how the various apparatus of an infant's life assembled and disassembled, they stood on the sidewalk outside Nadia's building with Alara between them in the carrier and the June afternoon moving around them warm and unglamorous and ordinary. He said she did well. She always does well at the doctor. She's saving the bad behavior for home. He almost smiled. Not quite. Is there anything she needs? That I can. Fine, she has everything. A pause. Nadia. She looked at him. He looked back. He had thought, over the past months, about what it would mean to arrive at some kind of articulation of all the things he understood differently now about her, about himself. About the specific ways in which a person can be brilliant at one kind of life and disastrously wrong about another. He had thought about it and had concluded, more than once, that the articulation was for him and not for her, and that offering it to her would be making her responsible for his reckoning, which he had already done enough of. But there was one thing. I know this isn't what you want to hear, he said. And I'm not saying it expecting anything, but I want to say it once, directly, and then I won't bring it up again. He looked at her steadily. You're what you did, Nadia. What you did in those weeks. What it took. I don't think I've ever seen anything. I don't have a way to say this. That doesn't sound like I'm trying to take something from it. He stopped. Tried again. I underestimated you for 4 years. In the specific way that men underestimate women who are quiet by confusing your composure for the absence of depth. I won't do that again. Not in how I see you. Not in how I see our daughter. She was quiet for a moment. The carrier moved slightly as Alara shifted, her small fist finding and gripping the strap. I know you believe that, Nadia said. No but. She looked at him directly. I know you believe it. I believe you believe it. She adjusted the carrier strap. I just think belief is the beginning, not the point. He nodded. I know. The point is Alara, she said. The point is who you are in her life. Over time. Without an audience. She paused. That's what she'll know you by. Not this conversation. I know, he said again. She said okay. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk outside her building in the June afternoon. He stood there for a while. He was not waiting for anything. He was not hoping for something to happen that would change the shape of what had just been said. He was simply present inside it, inside the specific and accurate weight of being told that belief was the beginning and not the point, and discovering that he agreed with it entirely. He walked back to his car. The months passed with the ordinary rhythm of lives that have been restructured around a new C center. Nadia went back to work in September, a consulting position she had secured through a contact that predated Damon, someone from the years before the marriage, who had known her capability before it had been organized around the needs of someone else's empire. The work was not glamorous. It was demanding and specific, and it required her to spend long hours rebuilding a professional identity that had been dormant for 4 years. And she did it with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything else. Since the night she had stood outside a study door and understood that her life required her to become something she hadn't known she already was. She was good at the work. She had always been good at it. She had just been doing it for 4 years, without compensation or acknowledgement, or any context that named it as skill rather than wifely function. She had been managing a household that was also a kind of command center, navigating social situations that required diplomatic precision, absorbing and processing information about complex power dynamics and behaving accordingly, and none of it had been named as the competence it was, because none of it had been hers. It was hers now. Simone watched Alara on the days Nadia was in the office, and the schedule didn't align with Damon's. Damon's schedule aligned more often than the formal arrangement required, not intrusively, not in a way that pressed on Nadia's established life, but consistently, and with the advanced communication that she had made clear was non-negotiable. He gave advance notice. He was where he said he was going to be. He brought Alara back when he said he would, fed and clean and increasingly, visibly content in a way that told Nadia, without either of them having to say it, that the hours were good for both of them. She did not ask about his life. He did not offer it. That was the container, and they both understood it, and it held. In October, she ran into Daniel Reyes on the street. It was outside the coffee place near her office in Midtown, and it was clearly accidental, the brief, startled recognition of two people who had not anticipated the proximity. He looked the same, maybe slightly tired around the eyes. He was carrying a paper bag from the deli next door, and he stopped when he saw her and did not immediately speak. She said, "Hi, Daniel." He said, "Hi." "Then, how are you?" "Good," she said. "Really good." She meant it. He could hear that she meant it. "Ilara's great. She's almost 9 months. She's into everything." Something in his face moved. Not grief, exactly. Something closer to relief, the specific relief of someone who has done a thing that cost them something and has been waiting, without the right to ask, to know whether it was worth it. "Good," he said. "I'm really glad." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "What you did. I know what it cost you." He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." She held his gaze. "You saw something that wasn't yours to carry, and you carried it anyway. And you did it in the way that actually helped, instead of the way that would have made you feel better. That's not a small thing." He was quiet. He looked at the ground briefly, then back up. "I should have done it sooner. Maybe. But you did it when it mattered." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." "You too," he said. "You and Alara both." She nodded. She walked away. She did not look back, and she did not feel walking away the complicated pull of an unresolved thing. It was resolved. It was clean. A man had made a decision that had cost him his position and his livelihood, and he had done it because it was the right thing, and she had thanked him, and it was done, and the simplicity of that, the clean legibility of it, so different from the murky, unnavigable complexity of everything else in the past year, felt as she walked down the Midtown sidewalk in the October air, like something worth noting. Some things in the human world were still simple. Some people still made decisions based on what was right rather than what was advantageous. It was worth knowing that. The last time Damon Vare sat in the apartment on East 74th Street, before it was transferred to its new owners, he sat in the empty living room on the floor because there was nothing left to sit on. And he looked at the walls and the windows and the particular light of a fall afternoon, coming through glass and laying itself across hardwood floors that had held 4 years of his life. He had come to do a final walkthrough. That was the official reason. Practical reason was that he had wanted one last moment inside the place before it became someone else's, and he had wanted it alone without performance or witness. He sat on the floor. He thought about Nadia standing in the kitchen, on the morning after he'd been in the study with Bianca, watching him flip his phone face down, saying nothing. He thought about what it had cost her to sit there. He thought about 11 days of her moving through this house with knowledge she didn't deploy, and what it meant that she had been capable of, that the patience of it, the strategy of it, the underlying conviction that she knew what she was doing and was willing to be lonely inside it until she was ready. He thought about a woman coming home with takeout bags through the side entrance because the front door stuck in cold weather parted. He thought about his daughter's fist. He stood up. He walked through every room once, without stopping, without lingering, not a sentimental goodbye, not a ceremony of any kind. Just the physical fact of passing through the spaces of a life he had built, and then damaged and then been required to dismantle, and understanding, by the time he reached the front door, that the dismantling had not been a loss in the simple sense he'd initially experienced it as. It had been a correction, a long, costly, painful correction, the kind that leaves permanent marks, the kind you carry in your body as changed posture and changed habits, and an altered sense of what you are capable of when you stop looking carefully at the things and people that deserve careful looking. He had been corrected. He was going to stay corrected. He opened the front door. He stepped out into the October afternoon. He pulled the door shut behind him and heard the lock engage with a sound he had heard thousands of times and was hearing for the last time, and he stood up front the step of the brown stone, on East 74th Street for a moment, with the city going on around him in its indifferent way, and he thought about Nadia's words in Arthur's conference room. You thought power meant people would stay, no matter what you did to them. He had thought that. He had operated on that premise for long enough that it had become invisible, an assumption so embedded it. No longer felt like an assumption, but like physics, like gravity, like a law of the world rather than a belief he had chosen. It was a belief he had chosen. He had been wrong. He walked to his car. He drove to Brooklyn. He arrived, as arranged, at 5 o'clock, and Nadia opened the door with Alara on her hip, and Alara saw him and made the sound she had been making for 3 weeks now, when she saw him, a specific, enthusiastic, completely undignified sound that had no word in any language yet, but that communicated, with total clarity, that she knew him and was glad he was there. He took her. She grabbed his collar with both fists and leaned back to look at his face with the focused scrutiny of someone conducting an important investigation, and he looked back at her with the uncomplicated presence of a man who was trying, with everything available to him, to be precisely the thing she was looking at, not a performance, not a managed version, just the actual specific human being that was all he had to offer. Nadia leaned against the doorframe. She watched them for a moment. She's been practicing sitting up, she said. She almost has it. Yeah, she gets frustrated when she falls. She makes this face. Nadia paused. Your face. He looked at her. She looked at him. It was not a warm moment. It was not the restoration of anything that had been lost. It was something smaller and more durable than either two people standing in a doorway with a child between them, in a life that had been broken and reorganized around what remained. And what remained was real and specific and alive and making an enthusiastic, undignified sound in his collar. I'll see you Sunday, he said. Sunday, she confirmed. He carried Alara to the car. He buckled her into the car seat that lived permanently in the back of his car now, the one he had learned to operate with the specific careful patience that car seats require, and that he had learned because there was no version of not learning it that was acceptable to him. Alara looked at the buckles with interest. She reached for one. He redirected her gently. He drove. She fell asleep 20 minutes into the drive, the way she always did in the car, suddenly and completely, like a switch being thrown. He checked the mirror when the sounds from the back seat stopped. She was asleep, with her head tipped sideways, and her mouth slightly open, and her hands curled in her lap, and he looked at her in the mirror for a moment, and then looked back at the road. He drove north through the city. The buildings moved past. The light changed. The ordinary Saturday afternoon continued its ordinary Saturday business around him. He had his empire. He had his people and his power and his position and the mechanisms of control he had spent 20 building into something that ran, with or without, his emotional availability. He had all of it intact, more or less, on the other side of the worst year of his adult life. He kept his throne. He was going to have to figure out, over time, and with the kind of sustained effort that had no clear ending, what it was worth. He thought it might be worth less than he had previously believed. He thought his daughter, asleep in the mirror, might be a reasonable place to start finding out what was worth more. He drove north. The city went on. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in an apartment with south-facing windows and slightly uneven, yellow walls, a woman who had stood in the worst hallway of her life and not screamed, and not collapsed, and not screamed, and not given the people who were taking from her the satisfaction of seeing her break. That woman was sitting in her kitchen in the October afternoon with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow and a legal brief open on the table, and the particular silence of an apartment that is hers, specifically and actually hers, and she was working. She was not thinking about him. She was not thinking about the house on East 74th Street or the study or the fireplace or the words she had heard through a 6-inch gap in a doorway that had changed the entire architecture of her life. She was thinking about the brief. She was thinking about the work. She was thinking about Sunday, when Alara would come back with her father's slightly sheepish expression that meant she'd been indulged at least once, in ways that Nadia would have to gently course correct. And about the Tuesday after that, when she had a meeting she'd been preparing for all week, and about the slow and specific and genuinely hers future that was being built, ordinary day by ordinary day, out of everything she had refused to surrender, and everything she had fought to keep, and everything she had discovered in the worst months of her life that she was capable of. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. The door was closed. The life behind it was hers.